Sure. Douglas Pipes, and I'm the composer of the score that was commissioned by the Dallas Chamber Symphony.
And I'm Richard McKay. I'm the artistic director of the Dallas Chamber Symphony, and I'll be conducting the premiere.
And I am Brian Satterwhite. I'm sort of the silent film consultant for the Dallas Chamber Symphony. I work with Richard in picking films and picking composers and kind of getting it all together, making sure that the concerts go off smoothly.
Can you spell your names for me?
Brian with an I, and last name is Satterwhite, Satter, and white like the color.
And Richard McKay, yeah, McKay.
And Douglas, last name Pipes, just like water pipes.
Got it.
Okay, so from the Dallas Video Festival perspective, they've been wanting to bring the Hitchcock 9 to town to do this, and so this was something that was, conceived last year, and but weren't able to do it. And then Bart met Richard and wanted to do a little recap of that because we have so many people here today, and talk about your connection with the Dallas Video Festival. If you would.
Sure. That connection began, I think, right around January or February of this year, when we had actually been referred to VideoFest and to Bart as just a good collaboration for a different project that we had been working on, which was the Sight of Sound project, which is where we prescribe classical music playlists, essentially, just short pieces of music that filmmakers are then encouraged to make short films for, and then we would screen those films in a contest in concert with the orchestra performing music live. And we debuted that earlier this year, and Bart came to that, and we had talked about the project and how to get that moving forward. And then I think probably the main catalyst that got everything moving forward for this partnership was really when he came to that concert in April and saw what we were doing with film.
And which concert was that?
That was the Sight of Sound concert I think it was on April 29th. And he came to that concert, and that was our season finale, and heard the orchestra doing not only music with film, but also Beethoven's Second Symphony without any film. And so I think what he left there getting an impression of was the type of audience that we have. They're a different kind of audience than what you might expect from a typical symphony orchestra. It tends to be younger. It's much more diverse demo. It's more casual, and it just feels different. It's very energetic. And so I think he got a sense of that. He also got the sense that our ensemble, which has done many things with film and music, is very experimental and happy to try new projects. And so from there we started talking about this collaboration, and we started making a short list of films that we might like to screen. And gosh, it took off so fast. It seems like just within a week or two we were talking about, well, who are we going to ask to compose this music?
And how did you land on the LODGER? How did all that come to be with you?
Well, early on it was probably, a lot of the thought process was, well, what kind of film would people want to see in October? And we were thinking we might have an October date. We were thinking maybe we should go into a Halloween direction or something. And so we started actually looking towards thrillers and suspense films and even horror films. But really, when we started talking about Hitchcock, and I watched some of his early films, that really drew us in because they have a remarkable, I think, a modern sort of feel and energy to them. They really don't strike me as being as dated as much as a lot of silent film can. It's an extremely powerful film. And when we arrived at that, I think we just thought we just couldn't go wrong with that. It was, and I do believe it is indeed the Dallas premiere of this remastered version. So, yeah, once Bart was all on board with Hitchcock, and I remember we did ask Douglas early on, and I think Brian also, about moving in directions on films, and I think what spoke collectively was to all of us was the Hitchcock. So.
And what's your process for working with Brian?
Okay, well, Brian has been I'd say just an extremely important influence on this, which would probably be worth talking about a little bit. Also, just how the film concerts got started, the orchestra in general. But I worked with Brian many years ago, back when I was at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was conducting their university orchestra, and I was studying there. And we actually worked together on a community theater project that involved a musical score that Brian was arranging, and I was rehearsing it and serving as music director. And yeah, at that time we just met, and he struck me as a very good person to know, just because he's very resourceful. He knows all about film and film music, and when I founded DCS a few years ago, and we started, we knew we wanted to do concerts with film, and so he was just the obvious collaborator to work with.
And if I can add, the way he came to me on that very first phone call that summer before DCS started, he said, "I'm in Dallas, I'm putting together a chamber symphony," and he said, "I want to devote 25% of the programming to film music." And he says, I want to ask you help on how we can fulfill that. And that doesn't necessarily just automatically mean rescoring a silent film. He was open for a broad range of options. How can we highlight the craft of music and film? What are all the different ways? We talked about it. The Sight of Sound competition was drawn from that, the silent film. There's even other avenues we haven't explored yet that where you can still focus on that. And that just struck me as a very cool thing to have an established group like that come in and say, well, I want to devote 25% to film music. That's music to my ears. and so the silent films came with that. And I remember that first season we talked about maybe commissioning a silent score or a score for a silent film, and being that this was your first season, that was a very ambitious. That's like, okay, maybe we do that season 2 or 3, because that's way too hard. That's a big project. It's very ambitious. So we kind of shelved it initially, and then I remember it was about a month later, which was only a couple months away from I think the concert starting or something. And he said, okay, I want to go ahead and do this. And
wait, what year was that?
Sorry.
What year was that?
That was 2012. So that would have been, I think I probably reached out to you in June or so.
Yeah, it was in the summer.
In the summer of 2012. And there was so much that happened, because it wasn't just the start of the film series, but it was the start of the whole season and the whole orchestra. So everything between June and August meant we had to program everything. And what was so magical about that time was they were building the City Performance Hall, which is a brand new venue. And we had this opportunity to open up that venue and be their first client to use the facility. And so that was all perfect timing. And we just assembled some of the finest musicians in Dallas to come and play in the group. And yeah, I think around August I called him back and said, I think it was an email actually. And it got so specific so quickly, is what I remember, because we were talking generally, well, maybe we could do some stuff with larger orchestra and some more traditional music. And as it went on, it just seemed a lot of people are already doing those other things. And I'm a composer myself, so I threw my hat in the ring early on. I said, hey, if we ever do go down that road, I would love to volunteer. He said, okay, that's good to know, and yeah, we'd definitely like to do that. But then it was like that next month he said, okay, I want to do a silent film, and we're going to go ahead, I want you to do it, let's go. And I was like,
oh, okay. It was real sudden, and I think I started writing like immediately because there wasn't a lot of time, you know.
And what was that one?
That was the Harold Lloyd film, A Sailor Made Man. In fact, I had to pick the film. You just said, let's do a film. And so I was like, okay. So I went and kind of picked the film out, I think the next day. It was real fast. And I also had to pick the film out for February as well. And I think I picked that one not too long after.
Right, that's right, which was The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah. We booked that, we put that down, and that was my, that sucked up a good chunk of my time for the next several months, which was great. I mean, it was one of the, since starting this project and working on it, I've done a lot of different things in my career, and I know Douglas will probably touch on this eventually, but these projects that I've done with them are some of the most fulfilling, satisfying works I've ever done.
That's wonderful.
They have just been so much fun, and it's been really cool for me to see from that very first concert where we kind of had an idea of what we were doing, but we're still learning now, so it's not like we've got it now, but it's a constant learning process. But from that first concert now to this is our 7th silent film.
That's right.
So it's something that I'm personally very proud of. I think it's very cool to see that grow like that.
And it's so important too, at least from my perspective, just as the conductor and committing to this course as far as commissioning new scores for silent film. It really can't be overstated the importance of just having really great collaborators. And Brian, I knew was a great choice because he meets deadlines, and he's a fantastic composer and really delivered a fantastic score for our first film, which ended up being very popular for us. But it's wonderful to have just available to you, and through people like Brian, just a great community of people who can write phenomenal scores relatively quickly, and just have them be scores that people love and want to listen to and experience in a concert. It takes a tremendous amount of knowledge and networking to achieve that, and so that's what's, I think, so special about it.
And I think I warned him too. It's like you realize this is like the hardest thing to do in conducting. A live performance to a film. It doesn't get. Conducting the ring cycle is going to be harder, but just I have lots of experience conducting a film, all within a studio, 2 or 3 minute chunks at a time in a studio. He's doing 40, 70, and now 90-minute chunks on stage with an audience behind him. No pressure, but it's difficult. And I praise him every time because it's not an easy thing to do, and he does a really, really good job of it.
So, tell us the connection with Douglas.
So Douglas is a composer whom I was a fan of before anything else. He scored a film called Monster House back in 2006.
Yeah.
And another film called Trick or Treat in 2008, which came out a couple years later. I'm constantly scouring the earth for film music. I'm a fan first. Everything I do, I'm a composer, and only things I'm a fan first, and that's how I spend my time. And fell in love with his 2 scores. Actually had written a review of his score for Monster House online, and he got wind of it and sent me a signed CD through the website address, just saying, "Hey, thanks for the review." And I'm like, "Oh, that was kind of cool."
That's cool.
And I shelved that, and then I can't remember. One time I was going out to LA, I contacted him. We've become friends ever since. So when the DCS comes along, I'm thinking of composers, and he just immediately came to mind, especially for the LODGER. It was top on my list. I remember, when you said this is what we're doing and the film and everything, I was like, okay, I hope I can get Douglas. I hope he's not too busy, because he was my number one choice. His music is perfect for this. It's dynamic. He kind of brings to the table everything that I'm kind of looking for in a silent film score. It's very narrative driven, but at the same time, the composition is interesting, and I don't know. It's just I'm a fan first, and I'm a fan of his work in general, especially the score. So it was just a good fit. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, yeah. Other than, I have to say, Brian wrote a review, going back to that review, Brian wrote a review of a film that I did, and the very next day, of anything that's ever been written, the very next day, I was getting calls from everybody, because it was a very popular website, and everyone in town read that website every single day. Everyone did, and as soon as it came out, it was very, very helpful in my career. I think it's nice to, in such a subjective area, it's nice to have someone say, "Hey, I believe in this person," because it lets other people say, "Cool, I liked it too, but since he likes it, I think I like."
Third-party validation, right? Awesome.
So I'm very indebted to him.
So, but this is your first silent film to score?
Yes, it is.
So, walk us through that process of how it's different than scoring a new film.
Well, the first obvious one is there's no director in this case, because Mr. Hitchcock's no longer with us, to tell any of us what he's looking for. So we are free to, all of us, make something that we hope represents the spirit of, I think, what he wanted. And the other big difference is because there's no team or a process whereby you go through and discuss as it's going along, this is much more organic and probably more true to how films used to be made, where a composer goes off, comes up with a score, comes out, and it's recorded. And in the case of a film where it's going to be tied to the film, there may be discussions in the studio and may be a couple takes or edits and things like this, but this is a concert, so it's all worked out in rehearsals, and then it gets to come to life in the hall. And I'm so excited to go into this hall. There is no more exciting place for a musician to have music played than in a fantastic sounding environment with fantastic musicians. Even in a recording studio, it doesn't even come close to the experience of this. And this will be the first time that I will get to have such a big piece recorded or performed in such an awesome environment. So I'm beyond thrilled.
And I think when I initially pitched you the whole idea, I don't know if I had to convince you, because I think you're pretty excited pretty early, but when I pitched him the whole idea, it's kind of like what he was saying. I love working with directors, and I'm sure he does too. There's a process of collaboration in film that's very cool, and it's one of the things I love about filmmaking. But I told him, it feels so good just to write what you want,
right?
And if you like it, then that's it. You move on. I mean, it just feels so good to finally not have to get approval and like I said, discuss things. It's just a refreshing feeling to be able to compose like that.
Brian, when you were saying that it went pretty fast? Was that why it went pretty fast?
It certainly helps. When, if all you have to do is please yourself, it certainly helps. You mentioned something about this was the quickest or the most music you've written?
The most music in such a short period of time, and part of that is because there aren't approval processes and re-edits, which all makes sense.
Yeah.
But the other part of the process is it's very common now to create a mock-up of what you're working, so directors and producers can hear the score and get a sense before you go in and record it with the real orchestra.
Like a demo version.
That process is a very time-consuming process as well, just to actually produce the score to be essentially put away, then go in and record it.
Right.
So there's a little bit of in that process, you have to beware of, I have to present music that everyone can relate to. So if I want to do things that are difficult for me to do with the technology available right at that moment, I have to do either workarounds or figure some way to talk them through it. But in this case, there's none of that. So there are things that you can do just in a writing standpoint that's completely free, and there's no worrying about how I would present this to someone, because I'm presenting it only to musicians who can look at the paper and read it. You can't present a score that wouldn't make any sense.
Right,
these days.
sure.
And it feels good. It's just a very
Yeah,
refreshing change of pace. Put it that way, yeah.
It certainly feels much more of the concert world than of the film.
And what's the process of picking your instrumentation? Is that a collaboration between you all?
Well, that primarily is dictated by practical forces in our concert programming. For example, when we started the film program with Brian's score for Sailor Made Man, on that program we were also performing John Adams' Chamber Symphony. And that had an instrumentation, I think, of about 15 players, and that we had working on that particular concert block. And so it just made sense to engage those same players, which we would already have on hand for the film score. So basically, I just say, here's what we're using.
Right.
Compose for this.
And that was kind of the only criteria. It's like, write whatever you want, but it has to be this instrumentation. I said, fine. I was like, great. I did ask for one more violin, I believe, to have the quartet.
That's right.
So I could have two violins, the cello, and the viola. So I could have a string quartet foundation. And he said, yeah, do that. So I added this, the second violin. But yeah, other than that, everything else is the same. And same, yeah. At least for my projects, I think the instrumentation has more or less been decided by those factors, and I'm fine with it. I kind of like, Douglas and I were talking about this the other day. It is cool to kind of pick out your instrumentation too, and I think you did a little bit of that, which he'll talk about, but I think all mine were prescribed to me, and it's kind of fun. I don't mind, like, opening up the secret basket and seeing what my instrumentation is, and then this is what I get to write for, I like that.
But you can't go crazy and like, I want a Celesta.
Well, I'm always joking, like, a good composer, they can do a score for tuba and kazoo. I mean, it's like the instrumentation, if you're good, that can be a challenge. It's like a chef with ingredients. A good chef can take any ingredients and make a great dish out of it. I kind of feel the same way about composing, and I love that challenge of whatever the instrumentation is, I'll go with it.
And with Caligari, it was actually a little unusual because we had a relatively small section of strings, but it was very bass heavy.
Yeah.
We had 4 cellos and we had 3 basses, and I think we only had 4 firsts violins, or maybe even 3 and 3. So it was a very bass heavy ensemble. And
which isn't typical, but when you said that, I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. I took that into account in the composition, and knew that I was going to have a lot of bass heavy stuff, and I factored that in.
There's solo bass parts, and so it was fantastic. I thought it worked great for Caligari in particular. It was so dark, it was perfect. And with instrumentation with Douglas's score, though, that was, I think, a little more diplomatic because he had a little more say because there are not other pieces on this particular program. It's a 90-minute film, so he knew he could choose. I think it was 10 musicians is what I prescribed, and then he went to town on that. And that's
So you just said the number, and then you picked the instrumentation.
That's right.
Yeah, and so that was a little bit of, that's obviously, I guess, I don't know, there's no perfect analogy, but if the analogy is you've got a lifeboat and you're thinking I've got 14 people, different instruments in the orchestra, and only 10 are going to get on it. I feel bad for some of those other players in the that aren't like, why your flute player is wondering, well, what did I do wrong? I'm not on this show. But I did get to pick those, and then as much as I could, made it possible if they could certain players can play multiple instruments of the same family, so I asked if that was doable, and I understand that that's pushing resources, but they were very considerate and did all my requests, so it's been fantastic.
Yeah, and some instruments are always requested by composers. I find just about every composer wants percussion, and then their ensemble, especially for film.
Well, especially, for chamber too, where you have some limitations in a chamber group, and your color palette's a little smaller with a chamber group. You add percussion to that, and that expands your color palette instantly, and it just gives you a lot to choose from. And you're talking about picking out instruments. If you're prescribed a percussion player, then you or the composer, both Douglas and I, in all of our projects, we get to pick the percussion instruments that we want. Most of the part. Some cost more than others. We have to get some approved, but essentially, you get a say in the percussion, and that's always cool.
And you could argue that this should be 2 percussion players
Yeah.
on this board.
It doesn't work at that one, but he was brilliant this week. I mean, we read the score yesterday for the first time, and man, they always come in with a game plan because they have so much equipment set up in front of them, and they have to move from one to the other so quickly and make sure they don't lose a beat in the process. It's extremely complicated.
And he was phenomenal. I was, I sort of sent the part off expecting to come back with notes saying this, this might not happen because of just logistics. And, he made up a plan and did everything, so.
Cool.
So Douglas, this is your first silent film to compose, so kind of walk us through the process. What was your research process? Where did you go to watch other silent films? What other silent films did you watch to kind of get an idea? And what was your research process on
So
this?
actually I didn't approach it from the idea of I was going to do it, really with the idea was I was going to create based on how I've seen other silent films. I wanted to just bring a fresh approach. Whether that's the smart thing or not the smart thing, that was what I chose to do. And I have enough history in watching Hitchcock films to have at least a sense of his sensibilities, I would like to think, in particular the musical. And so understanding that now we're much later in the game, I tried to approach it in a way that was both respectful of the period, but not tied to the period, and using things that make a little more sense as things have come since that point in time, but all the while being as faithful as I can to the film, and hopefully everything, the intent is that the score still illuminates Mr. Hitchcock's intentions and doesn't do anything that would get in the way of whatever he's trying to do.
When I pitched the idea to other composers, I talked to other composers about DCS and doing these things. The term that I use, and goes back to it's very similar to what he said, the first score that I did. I said, I wanted to deliver a fresh experience rooted in nostalgia, so that you're not just copying music from the past. You're rooted in that style and that flavor, but you are bringing it something fresh. And when I'm talking to other composers, I'm not looking for an esoteric, abstract, crazy score. I don't think that's quite what our mission is. It's still to put the film as the film is the star of the show, and people are there to enjoy the film, and so that's kind of when I pitched around to the composer. I can't remember if I mentioned that term to you, but yeah, it's the same. It's a very similar approach that at least we're trying to take collectively.
As the film programmer, can you talk a little bit about how you program your films? I mean, there's just a lot of silent film that's out there. It's not, it's only about 10% of what was totally shot, back in the industry. But
Right.
Can you kind of talk about, like you do work with the Chamber Symphony. So when they say, hey, we want to do a Halloween or holiday theme program, where do you go? What is your process as a programmer?
The very first thing that comes into play, and it's not that glamorous, is the time slot. He comes and say, okay, we need either a 40-minute, a 40-minute piece or 2 20-minute pieces. We've only got this much time for a first half. And that kind of limits already a lot of things. So I ask him, how much time do we have to work with, and he'll tell me, and it's like that kind of gives me a strategy for seeking out films.
So no Greed, for example.
Yeah, with the very first film, there were 2 other pieces on the program. So, and the only other thing that was going to be on the program was this film. So it couldn't be 10 minutes, couldn't be 20 minutes, that's too short for a second half. It couldn't be an hour, that was kind of too long. So it was hard to find an in-between 20 and 60-minute film. In fact, one of the only ones that I found was their Harold Lloyd, and he called it an extended short. Mm-hmm. It's a 4-reel short film, but and at the time it was technically the first comedy feature really ever made, even though he called it an extended short, because most comedy shorts during the day were either 1 or 2 reels. This was a 4-reel, so it was just longer than anybody had ever seen, and it just happened to be it was 42 minutes, I believe, and it was perfect for a second half of a program. And so, you know, no matter how many other ideas I had, most of them were already stricken off the list because they were too long, too short. Caligari was a little bit more freedom because that was going to be the only film on the program. So I was able to kind of go and look at a lot of different feature films. Caligari is just, I'm a fan of, and I just thought this orchestra, that, you know, during the first season, I think this would really make a statement. I think it would be bold and kind of, you know, I could already tell he's ambitious and he doesn't want to follow the status quo. So I thought the Caligari would be a risk, but also deliver something really cool. And then the 3 short films that we did in one program was the hardest, just because now you have technically a big time slot, but we want 3 composers doing 3 films, so I had to find 3 short films that worked well together and added up to a certain time. And that was probably the longest process. We went back with a few ideas. He didn't like some of the films that I picked. We finally found 3 that I thought worked really well, and you know, so it's been a process. With the Lodger, it was already picked out, so I had nothing to do with picking out that one. Sherlock Jr., which you did the last time. I remember there was a process there. I liked that one, and I can't remember the process. There's another one. I just liked the film a lot and sent it to him, and he liked it too. So it's not a whole lot of thought into it, other than the most thought is just in the time. That's kind of how it is.
Yeah, I think blending film and a symphony orchestra is a complicated thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's really, there's no one out there doing what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
I mean, there are people who are doing orchestra with film, but there's probably no one spending as much time kind of melding the symphonic world with the film into a cohesive, curated format, quite the way we do. So that's.
And I let him deal with that. I mean, you got the other pieces in mind, and you're thinking about the film, and I just adjust the film based on what I think would be cool, and then you kind of take the piece and fit in with your other stuff, and yay or nay it. So.
And that's worth pointing out too. A lot of orchestras program differently when they use film, in that it's a film concert only, or it's a pops concert.
Yeah.
And what's unique about what we're doing is that there's all kinds of stuff on our program. It really is a very diverse and sometimes for some people challenging, maybe even jolting in a good way experience, where people will come and, for example, that concert with the 3 films. Mm-hmm. I mean, it started with Bach's Brandenburg Concerto, which everyone would like and appreciate. It's beautiful, but it's standard repertoire. And then we cut real deep to Britten's Serenade for tenor, horn, and strings, and that's a very that's a deep cut. That's something you don't hear often, and it's something that is going to challenge most audiences. And not only that, but of course the solo horn and the solo tenor who perform it. And then on the second half, after an intermission, we've got 3 quick comedies that are linked together pretty well. I think they just work as a great unit. So. It really is hard to imagine a more diverse concert experience, and to this date, I would say that was probably one of our most successful for that reason.
Mm.
Yeah.
Speaking of success, you have a younger, crowd that follows you, unlike, most symphonies across America. So, and a lot of times you're introducing silent film to the first time to these young professionals, these young people. Can you talk a little bit about that? What was your worries, when you first started doing this? What are your concerns, and what has your patrons and supporters have said?
Gosh, those are great questions. So the first part of that, I would say that I wasn't too terribly worried initially, because I remember the process that we described earlier here about how we arrived at doing silent films with music. That happened kind of late for in the process for us, and I didn't at that time, because we hadn't founded the orchestra, I didn't really know who our audience was going to be. Mm. So I wasn't worried about alienating an already existing audience. And I'm still not particularly worried about that, because we're a small enough organization still. I mean, we're a lean enough ensemble, and we're still building audience in a rapid enough and flexible enough way that there's not a community that we have that isn't already ready to move in some new direction and experiment and try some new things. We're not stuck the way a lot of the large or long existing organizations are, because they have to bring all of their patrons with them, and just as soon as you program Britney Serenade for tenor horn and strings, you're going to get hate mail about it. But no, I was never worried about it in that way. But as far as what I hear from people, what I've been surprised about is it is surprising how many young people really like this. I mean, I before starting this orchestra, I had an idea of film, and it was a very mainstream idea. And so where I was coming from was just mainstream cinema, and I might have assumed that there were plenty of people who were in that boat as well. But yeah, young audiences certainly can, I think, get into a film like The Lodger and early Hitchcock. It does feel very modern, and people who discover it seem to be delighted by it.
I remember the first concert, and I remember this composing. I want to find out if you had the same experience, but composing that first score, I'm a huge Harold Lloyd fan. I mean, I think he is a genius. I think he is the best of the big three. He's my personal favorite. And I felt this huge responsibility. Like, I want to deliver the genius of Harold Lloyd to a modern audience. And I hope they get it. I want them to see his genius and appreciate it, and maybe find some new fans. And I felt this huge responsibility. Like, I'm hoping that people become fans of this guy because of this experience. And I remember there's a comedy gag in the very beginning of the film. And I went out, said my introduction, and then went off stage, and the concert started as I'm walking around the theater. I can kind of hear it, and I went to the back of the theater, and I got into the back, and I'm pretty nervous. That again, I don't know what to expect, and I'm sitting in the back of the hall before I find my seat, and that first gag is coming up, and I waited, and then the comedy gag happened, and when the whole hall erupted in laughter, I was just like, I mean, I felt getting goosebumps just talking about it. I mean, that was my goal. That was like the big work. That was the big moment where I realized, wow, I think we got them. And they were on board the rest of the way. And that was one of the more thrilling moments I've ever had as a composer. To hear them laugh at that moment, I just.
What film?
It was A Sailor Maid Man, the Harold Lloyd from 1920, I believe it was, and. Yeah, it was just a really great moment.
Well, the musicians, of course, have a very different perspective, because someone starts laughing in the middle of their concert. And I mean, of course, the musicians have, not the best seat in the house as far as watching the film. Obviously, I mean, they often don't. They don't have a real big idea of how what they're creating fits with the film perfectly. They really are the last to learn that when we sync up the music and the film and we share it with them, and then they say, "Oh, that's what I was creating."
I had a trombone player come to me after that first concert and say, "What was happening when I was doing this thing?" I had to explain it to him because he didn't know.
So he didn't see it.
He doesn't get to see the film. He had this really kind of cool part where he just did a big trombone slide. He's like, he was just curious, like, what was happening on screen while that happened? Yeah, sadly, they don't get to enjoy it.
So they don't see it even silent before they're...
Some of them probably
maybe, but not with the music they're playing, and it's literally like right there. I mean, if they stop playing and went like that, they could watch it. But there's never a moment where they could stop playing and do that. So it's going on while they're doing their job.
Yeah.
Wow.
One of the surprising things also about the Harold Lloyd that you mentioned, liking Harold Lloyd, this is something that the audiences all seem to agree with. They typically come to our concerts, especially in that concert where we did a Chaplin, a Keaton, and a Lloyd. But when they come in, and they're usually coming in expecting to like Chaplin the best, because he's the best known, the most well known, and or maybe also Keaton. But everyone goes home thinking Lloyd is just incredible, and he's just so funny and so much fun. And I love Lloyd now, and I didn't know much about Lloyd before we started this, and we're screening Bumping into Broadway in February of this year, and it's just an adorable, hilarious film. It's great.
Can you kind of talk about some of the technical aspects of putting on, doing a silent film versus just doing a everyday garden concert?
Sure. Well, Brian plays an important role in the technical side of preparing what I need to see in addition to the score while we're performing. So, with a normal concert, we'll be performing music that most people have already heard before, and we'll be performing perhaps standard repertoire. I'll have a score on my stand, I'll study that score for a long period of time, we'll get together, we rehearse it and perform it, and it just seems so simple when we have concerts like that, by comparison, because everyone shows up with their instrument, I show up with the score, everyone knows how to execute really well in that traditional concert format. But what we're doing here adds in, of course, the film and then a computer, which is on a stand in front of me as I conduct. And so right above my score, as I read along with the orchestra and cue and set tempos and perform the work with them, I'm also having to watch cursors as they cross the screen and timing marks that align with timing marks in the score that are printed. So I can always look at that and get a sense of maybe I'm a few seconds behind or a few seconds ahead. What I always want to do is stay close enough to the proper time where I can hit those really hard arrivals where something very important happens that really has to correspond with the score. And not everything is that way, but there are all these little indicators that I'm constantly assessing just to make sure that the tempos are spot on and that we're very close and that everything works as it's planned for.
And that is designed. I mean, when we first talked about doing this before the first season, that was a big question. How does this happen technically? And there's a lot of ways to do it. There's multiple ways that you can go about putting live music to film in a live performance. The easiest and most surefire way to do it is with a click track. So that you program the click, it's like a metronome, and the conductor would be wearing headphones, and each player would be wearing the headphones, and they would have the metronome in their ears, and it's very, very easy. You'll never get off as long as you're with that metronome. But there's a problem in that, and that it works well in a studio situation, but the more we talked about it, the more I was realizing, this is still a live concert. This is still a live performance. I want it to feel and breathe and be a live performance. So we kind of nixed the click track. As safe and wonderful as it would be, it's still very, regimented and static. I want it, and I explain to every composer that we hire on, I explain this process, like, while you're composing, allow some ebb and flow with the music, because it needs to do that. It needs to kind of expand and contract and in the middle sections and things like that, because that's what live music should do. And so once we decided, we're going to go ahead and conduct these strictly to picture and have no click track, then we set out and to make that happen with the monitor and everything like that. But it still would be 1,000 times easier to do it with click. But I think it's for the audience, it's much better to hear that live performance quality in it.
Right, when there are visual cues, also in the event that you're not exactly with the film in a place where it's not real critical, you really have tremendous discretion as how you get back with it. You can speed up a phrase, start the next phrase a little bit faster, catch up some speed, so you can adjust in an extremely natural way, in a way that you cannot, I think, with the click track. It's so much more musical.
And I remember telling him that too, like, because you'd never conducted a picture before, that first concert, and I remember saying, don't worry about getting off. If you realize, oh my gosh, I'm a few seconds behind, or a few seconds ahead, don't worry about that. Just know where you are, so that the next opportunity you can kind of line things back up. And I just think that's such a big, important part of the live performance aspect of it all.
I'm sorry.
So, Douglas, you mentioned you were familiar with Hitchcock's, the stuff we know really well. So, just when you saw the LODGER, because it's not well known, it hasn't been seen a lot, sort of what were your impressions of that in context of what we would see later from Hitchcock? And was it sort of difficult to get the Bernard Herrmann, some of the well-known music from his later films, out of your head or out of your thinking?
That's a good question. So, I don't think first of all, in watching the film, it was what are the main themes of this film and how best to recreate those. And there are themes of romance and there are themes of violence are the two sort of main themes in the film. And of course, suspicion and sort of looking around your back, not knowing what's going on, and fear in the community. And approaching music in a way, I certainly don't, go watch Hitchcock films. I'm sort of, having been through enough of his scores, get a sense of sensibilities that just, if anything, helped me feel like, as I was going through the process of it, maybe thinking that my choices in taste and color would be welcomed by him, if that makes sense. It's certainly, maybe the first thing that's apparent is, as opposed to having, maybe free reign of the size of a group that he may have used in some of his later scores, it's that aspect is taken away by the instrumentation that we have. And I think it works remarkably well for the silent film, as opposed to plastering a bunch of music on a film where there's other sound and everything else and dialogue. So the music is, you can have more music, but there's other things in there. The approach here is, not only is the film silent, but the action in the film requires some silence from the audience, from the entire. There's a lot of looking over your shoulders. Sort of the mood of the film is not big, loud. It's silent and creaky in there in the house, and wondering who's, what's going on, and suspicions. So I think it all works well, and I never felt like there was. I mean, quite honestly, I didn't think of Bernard Herrmann at all through the process. I thought of the DCS, who I'm going to be doing this with, what might make the most sense for this film, and that it would, one, that it would work for the audience in the context of seeing that film today, and that it would make sense with the film that's shown.
So, what are your feelings about sound effects?
You mean in the context of this film?
Putting it in the score, like if there's a knock at the door, or if there's a scream, or if there's a, just those kinds of sound effects. Are they present, or
Like using music?
Yeah, the music.
Yeah, and so I would say in this score there isn't. I might expect that in some comedy scores that kind of thing might take place more. But in this film there are some, not sound effects, but there are some things that are meant to, not literally, but evoke feelings of certain situations and certain sounds that might be heard in the house or in the neighborhood or in the environment. And they're few and they're very much not literal, but there are things in there that are less tonal musical aspects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I mean, I don't think I've ever done a direct trying to mimic a sound effect, but I have done something musical that relates to a certain sound. But it's not. It's a very rare kind of occasion, and in comedies, I think you see a little bit more of that. But yeah.
And even if it's not exact in comedy, sometimes it just accents things where you see they're mimicking the sound of something,
Right.
and not trying to be a doorknob. They're just trying to make it funny.
Right.
And that can be, I think, very distracting sometimes in a film as well. I mean, that's something we have to consider. I remember in Caligari, there was a moment where there was a bell that rang, and the texture that we had was just, all strings. And so what do you do at that moment in a silent film where there's a bell that rings, and you've got strings on stage. And that's an important artistic decision, I think, to make. I mean, so I think we talked about.
I sent you an email. Yeah, I sent you an email saying, there's this, the guy's up there ringing a bell, calling people to the thing, and I thought about maybe we should get a bell and I'll just get some, one of the players to play it. But yeah, that was the word you used. Like, that could be a distraction. And I thought, I was like, yeah, and people can see he's ringing a bell. You don't need to hear it to know exactly what's going on. Does it actually help the experience? Not necessarily. I don't think it does. And because you're hearing this completely opposite sound from the nice homogeny of a string orchestra, you get this bell ringing. I agree. Like, yeah, I think it would be too distracting, and then we skipped it and moved on. He's just sitting there, ringing a bell in silence while the strings are doing their thing. So.
Brian, is with the silent films, is comedy? Does comedy speak to you more from a musical sensibility? I mean, you've done Caligari, but you seem to gravitate to those. Or, would you think about doing something like Patrick Joan of Arc? Or
I don't know. I wouldn't go so far to say I think it speaks more. But yeah, I love the comedies. There's something musical that I feel like I have the freedom to do in a comedy that you really can't do in other films. Having said that, I love drama. I love the stuff in Caligari. I would love to do something that's dramatic, a thriller, or anything like that. But comedies are just fun. And I think the two that I've done with the DCS, I was just able to do things that I couldn't imagine writing in any other type of film ever. And it's just fun. From a composer standpoint, anytime you get to do something fresh and new like that, it's just it's a nice thing.
I will add that the successful execution of comedy music is the most difficult film music to
is. It is. There's a fine line between being jokey with it, which you can do. In the sound film, you can do a little bit of, but you still have to kind of play most of it pretty straight. It is a difficult thing, and I don't even know if. Somebody said, "Well, how do you do it?" I don't know if I have an answer for that. I think with the two films I did, it was more of a gut feeling. Like, did this feel right? I tried different things. Yeah, this feels. I'm thinking I'm getting that. But if I had to sit down and how do you score a comedy, I don't know.
you can't. The music can't make people laugh, but it can help them laugh.
Right.
So where does the score go from here? So tomorrow you guys are going to play it live for the first time. Where does it go from here? Does it go into an archive? Do you put it on a DVD and sell it, or what do you want to do with this? You guys spent a great deal of time and passion on this.
Well, that's a great question. I guess I would have to say we don't have any concrete plans for it. However, perhaps you could speak a bit about the composer's perspective in what happens to a piece after it's commissioned and premiered, what the life cycle could be, or...
Yeah, other than everything I've heard today here has been owned by a film company, and there hasn't been any other external life from those. But I suppose it would be awesome if there was ever another opportunity where someone else wanted to do a concert with it, and then I would discuss with you what that entails. But I would think that it would be, I don't know what if 10 years from now you have a recital or a season where you do a bunch of other things, but there's no reason why what they've done can't be recreated somewhere else under their guidance and help if there's a group and a place that wants to put on a concert.
It's been on my list of things to do, to shop it around to other groups wherever they may be, and but that's a time-consuming process, just like everything else. But it's something that I've thought of doing. Love to have happen in the future, but no concrete plans as of yet.
Yeah, and it's readily achievable. I mean, the score. Anyone can play it. And
they commissioned it and paid for it. It's all done. The part score is all ready to go. So anybody that wants it, it's all the work leading up to it has been taken care of. So
So what's next for each one of you in the next 6 months to a year? What are your future projects? What are you working on?
Oh goodness. I multitask. As a good friend of mine often tells me, I multitask more than anybody he knows. So I have so many pots on the stove that are going on at any one given time. There's another film that I'm working on kind of slowly. It's for a friend of mine that I've actually been working on for a while. One of those work on it when you can kind of thing. I've been working on it for about 5 or 6 months. I'm going to be finishing it up here in the next month and a half. And after that, I'm also a film editor. I'm going to be editing a documentary that I've been working on for a while. Just a lot of little things that kind of keep me busy. Again, all these pots on the stove that are going off keep me busy.
And so Dallas Chamber Symphony is my full-time occupation, and so we'll be working on our next production, which is a concert on November 18th, and it's a great program. It's Von Williams' The Lark Ascending, and we'll have Chloe Trevor soloing on that. She's our principal second violin, but she'll be soloing on that. It's a gorgeous piece, very pastoral. And then Ives Symphony No. 3, which is a chamber-sized symphony. And then we'll have the winner of the Dallas International Piano Competition, which we host annually at SMU. Kyle Orth will come and perform Mozart's Piano Concerto in D minor, his 20th concerto. And so that's November 18th, and then in February, bumping into Broadway, Copeland's Appalachian Spring, February 17th, and Sight of Sound again next April on the 28th, I believe. So it's a good full season for us at DCS.
Cool. And for me, in the very short term, the score that I did for film Trick or Treat is being released on vinyl this month by Waxworks Records. So track that down. And scoring assignments are being actually worked out right now, so I can't comment on that because I don't know the specifics or if something it's in that phase. And in the midterm or in between things, I'm developing a musical with Kobe.
So, can you give us the all the details for the LODGER tomorrow night?
Sure. So.
And
yeah.
Like ticket sales and where it is and times.
Absolutely.
All that.
So tickets are available now, and they start at $19 and go all the way up to $59, but that includes a VIP pass to the after party, which is hosted by Proof and Pantry just across the street from the concert hall. So people can come in, catch the film, and as they exit, they just cross the street, go over to Proof and Pantry, and they are sponsoring the event with complimentary drinks and appetizers right after the show. The event starts at 8 p.m. at Dallas City Performance Hall, and doors open at 7. And so it's going to be a magical night. It's going to be fantastic. Of course, Douglas will be there. I think he'll be giving some comments before the event as well to audience members who want to come and meet him. And the musicians as well will be at the after party, so people can come and mingle with everyone.
And they'll welcome too?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
We'll be there. So.
Anything else, you guys?
Dallas Chamber Symphony, I've never heard of it until, you guys' partnership with VideoFest. We all heard of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra. Why should somebody take a look at the chamber? Well, what's different about your organization versus the Dallas Symphony or even the Richardson Community Symphony?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And one of the unusual things about Dallas until very recently was it was one of a very small number of large cities that did not have a professional chamber orchestra. And most large cities have a chamber orchestra, and chamber orchestras typically focus on chamber repertoire. So there is a vast body of repertoire written for orchestra or a small orchestra, and so we really specialize in repertoire that requires, say, 10 to 40 or so musicians. So that's generally where we're performing. And of course, the instrumentations are specified in the scores, and all of the great composers we know and many modern composers are all writing for chamber repertoire. So we really perform that repertoire, whereas a lot of larger orchestras are not. We're also a professional orchestra, so unlike many community ensembles, all of our musicians are extraordinarily well trained, graduates of great conservatories, often performing in other fantastic orchestras in town. And so these are some of the finest musicians you'll find performing a type of repertoire that is often unheard. And finally, the general vibe you get from our programming is so much more experimental than you would ever see from, you know, a typical large orchestra or any orchestra. It's programming in that manner can be risky for a number of reasons, just because people don't always know what they're going to see, and they might not be familiar with the composers, and they might not be familiar with the soloists. They might never have seen anything like what we're doing before. It really takes someone who's just going to take the plunge, come and see something that is generally very experimental, and experiencing the kind of sound that you get from a smaller ensemble, where you can truly hear through the texture and hear a unity of sound that chamber ensembles require, because it's such a transparent texture. You hear every musician, you can feel that energy on stage. Tempos tend to be a little bit faster because it's just a smaller apparatus on stage. Just the whole sense of how the music works is different, even when you take a piece that's ordinarily performed by a large orchestra and pare it down to something smaller. It's just a completely different vibe. It's a different energy, and it is extremely intimate. And with Dallas City Performance Hall, where we have a great space, it seats 750, and it's acoustically just fantastic. It's really the first time Dallas has had a place that could support an orchestra that does exactly what we do.
If I could just add, as far as the films go, I mean, he said the word intimate. I mean, I think to me, that's the word that sums it all up. That's the one word answer I would give, and especially when it comes to the film, because I mean, these silent films, to have them performed, the score performed live by a small chamber group is really like, I think, how it was intended to be. They didn't have 100-piece orchestras performing these scores, back in the 1920s. They were small groups, and you have this beautiful, intimate hall. Films themselves, I think, when you watch a movie, it's an intimate experience. It's a very personal experience. You connect with the characters on screen, things like that. And so, by having this intimate space, intimate ensemble film, I just think that makes for. I love, orchestral music, concert music. I love the big symphonies, but this is so unique, and it taps into something that I personally have not been able to see anywhere else. So it's really. I'm jealous. I'm from Austin, and so I always say I'm jealous Dallas has this going on up here.
Douglas,
Well, I would just add to that a lot of people experience orchestral music through film music, because a lot of film music is acoustically based orchestral music, not all of it. And a lot of people like that music, and if you've never gone out and seen orchestral music performed live in a concert hall, you will be blown away. It's the most it's as if everything comes to life. So if you like things like that, and most people do, most people actually love this type of music, and it's unfortunate that they haven't experienced it live with fantastic players, and to have this fantastic hall in a city like this is a jewel that needs to be supported like you can't imagine.